Janet and James had always been friends. From the moment they met in primary school, their bond was very strong. Janet was a quiet, shy girl who often sat at the back of the class, her nose buried in a book. She was the type of child who spoke only when spoken to, often blending into the background. But James was her opposite in every way. He was outgoing, fearless, and full of energy. His voice was always the loudest during break time, and he had a way of drawing people to him with his charm. Janet admired his confidence from afar, but she never imagined he'd notice her. That changed one fateful afternoon during break time. Janet had wandered to the edge of the playground, clutching her snack in her small hands, when a group of boys surrounded her. They teased her relentlessly, pulling at her braids and mocking her quiet nature. "Why are you always so quiet, Janet?" one boy sneered. "Do you even know how to talk?" Another boy snatched her snack. "What's this? You're eating this? No wonder you're so boring." Tears welled up in Janet's eyes, but she didn't know how to defend herself. Just as she was about to break down, a voice rang out. "Leave her alone!" James's voice boomed across the playground. He marched up to the group, his small frame radiating confidence. The boys turned to him. "And what are you going to do about it, James?" one of them challenged. "I said, leave her alone," James repeated, stepping between Janet and the boys. His fists clenched at his sides, and though he was smaller than most of them, there was a fire in his eyes that made them think twice. The boys exchanged nervous looks before mumbling insults and walking away. James turned to Janet, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Janet nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Thank you, James," she whispered, her big brown eyes shimmering with gratitude. In that moment, she felt an unspoken connection with him, a sense of safety she'd never felt before. From that day forward, James became her protector. He walked her home from school, helped her with her homework, and always made sure she had someone to sit with during lunch. They became best friends, and as the years passed, their bond only grew stronger. Janet relied on James for everything, and he, in turn, found joy in being there for her. By the time they reached secondary school, their friendship had transformed into something deeper. James began noticing the way Janet's smile made his heart race, and Janet couldn't help but admire how kind and thoughtful he was. They spent hours talking about their dreams, their fears, and everything in between. One evening, as they walked home together, James broke the silence. Janet walked a few steps ahead of him, her laughter echoing in the warm evening air. "Janet," James called softly, his voice trembling slightly. She turned to him, her smile fading as she noticed the serious expression on his face. "What's wrong, James?" He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. "I've liked you for so long," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want us to be more than friends, Janet." Janet's cheeks flushed. Her heart jumped as she looked at him, searching his eyes for sincerity. She had always felt the same way, but had been too scared to admit it. "I feel the same," she said shyly, her voice quivering. James's face lit up with a smile so radiant it made Janet's chest tighten. "Really?" he asked, stepping closer to her. She nodded, her cheeks still red. "Yes, James." From that moment on, their relationship blossomed into a beautiful love story. They were inseparable, spending every spare moment together. James was fiercely protective of Janet, and she adored him. Their love became the talk of the neighborhood. People would point them out on the street saying, "Those two are meant to be." It seemed like nothing could come between them. But life, as it often does, had other plans. After their final exams, James suggested they check their genotypes. He didn't think much of it. It was just something responsible couples did. When the results came back, they sat in silence, staring at the papers in disbelief. "A yes?" Janet whispered, her voice cracking. Tears filled her eyes as the weight of the revelation sank in. James reached for her hand, his own trembling. "It's going to be okay," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Deep down, he knew what this meant. "What are we going to do?" Janet sobbed. "I don't want to lose you, James." James's heart broke as he pulled her into his arms. "Janet, I love you," he said softly, "but we can't ignore this. It wouldn't be fair to our future children. We have to let go." The words felt like daggers to his own heart, but he knew it was the right thing to do. They cried together that night, holding on to each other as though they could stop time. The breakup was devastating for both of them. James threw himself into preparing for his studies abroad, hoping the distance would help him move on. Janet, on the other hand, stayed behind, trying to rebuild her life. She focused on her small business, but no matter how busy she kept herself, her thoughts always drifted back to James. She missed his laughter, his warmth, and the way he made her feel safe. Years passed, but the pain lingered. Janet tried to move on, but no one compared to James. Sometimes late at night, she would lie awake, wondering if he ever thought about her. Did he miss her? Was he happy? Meanwhile, James was thriving abroad. He earned his degree, built a successful career, and made a life for himself. But despite his achievements, he felt an emptiness that he couldn't explain. He tried dating, but no one could fill the void Janet had left in his heart. Then, one sunny afternoon, fate intervened. James had returned to Nigeria to visit his family and run some errands at the mall. As he wandered through the busy stalls, his eyes landed on a familiar figure. She was bent over a table, examining a stack of fabrics. "Janet," he called out, his voice filled with disbelief. She turned around, her heart skipping a beat as her eyes met his. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The noise of the bustling market faded into the background, and all Janet could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. They stood there, staring at each other, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Then, before either of them could think, James pulled her into a hug. Janet melted into his arms, and for the first time in years, she felt whole again. "It's been so long," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Too long," Janet replied, tears streaming down her face. In that moment, all the pain, all the years of separation, seemed to fade away. It was as though they had been given a second chance, and neither of them wanted to waste it. They started seeing each other again, and it wasn't long before their feelings reignited. Every shared glance, every laugh, and every lingering touch felt like a spark to a fire that had never truly gone out. James would show up at Janet's shop after work, helping her arrange her goods as they talked about their lives, their dreams, and what could have been. Janet's heart warmed with every visit, her cautious walls slowly crumbling. One quiet evening, they sat on a bench outside Janet's shop. James broke the silence, his voice hesitant. "Janet, I've been thinking, maybe we should check our genotypes again." Janet froze. Her heart jumped. Memories of the heartbreak they'd endured the first time came flooding back. "James, what if nothing has changed? What if we go through that pain all over again?" Her voice cracked. James reached for her hand, his eyes sincere. "I don't know what we'll find, Janet, but I can't stop thinking about how we found our way back to each other. What if this is God giving us a second chance?" She stared at him, his words stirring something deep within her. After a long pause, she nodded. "All right, James, let's do it." The wait for the results was agonizing. Janet found herself praying fervently, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. James stayed by her side, trying to remain optimistic, but equally nervous. Finally, the day arrived. They sat together at the clinic as the doctor handed them their results. Janet opened hers first, her hands trembling. Her eyes widened, her lips parting in disbelief. A," she whispered, barely audible. James quickly opened his own, and his face lit up with shock and joy. "AA," he confirmed, turning to her with glistening eyes. "We're both AA." Janet covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. "How is this possible?" she cried, her voice breaking. "James, this can't be real." James pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as his own tears fell. "I don't know, Janet," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "But I believe this is a second chance for us. This is our miracle." Their love story resumed with a renewed sense of purpose. James became even more attentive, and Janet's smiles grew brighter with each passing day. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the city, James surprised her with the proposal of her dreams. He arranged for a small band to play her favorite song at a quiet park, where he got down on one knee. "Janet," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you are my everything. I've loved you for as long as I can remember. You are my past, my present, and my future. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Janet's eyes as she nodded, barely able to speak. "Yes, James. 1,000 times yes." Janet and James began planning their wedding, dreaming of a life filled with love and joy. They imagined a home filled with laughter and children, building the family they had always wanted. But just as their happiness seemed unshakable, life delivered another blow. On the night of their engagement party, the celebration was in full swing. The hall was alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses as guests toasted to the couple. Janet wore a radiant smile, her dress shimmering under the lights. James stood beside her, his hand on the small of her back, looking at her with nothing but love. Then, the doors to the hall swung open. A hush fell over the room as a woman stepped in, holding the hand of a small boy. Janet's smile faltered as her eyes fixed on the intruder. It was Clara, James's ex-girlfriend. Her expression was cold and resolute. "James," Clara said loudly, her voice cutting through the chatter, "meet your son." The room went silent. All eyes turned to James and Janet. Janet felt her heart plummet as she stared at the boy. He looked about 5 years old, with dark, familiar eyes. James froze, his face a mixture of confusion and shock. "Clara," he managed to say, his voice shaky, "what are you talking about?" Clara stepped forward, her grip firm on the boy's hand. "This is your child, James. His name is David. He's 5 years old." Janet felt her legs weaken, the ground beneath her threatening to give way. She clutched James's arm for support, her mind spinning. She turned to James, searching his face for answers, but he looked as lost as she felt. I don't understand," James stammered. "Clara, this can't be true. Why didn't you tell me?" Clara's lips curved into a bitter smile. "I don't owe you an explanation, James, but I thought your fiancé deserved to know the truth." The room filled with murmurs, but Janet couldn't hear anything. Her ears rang as she stared at the boy. Was this really James's child? How could he not have known? That night, Janet lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind filled with questions. Was James hiding something from her? Could she trust him? The thought of him having a child with someone else was a blow she hadn't been prepared for. The next day, James showed up at her door, looking haggard and desperate. "Janet, please," he begged. "Let me explain." She opened the door, her face emotionless. "You have 5 minutes," she said coldly. "I didn't know," James said, his voice filled with desperation. "Clara and I broke up years ago. She never told me she was pregnant. I swear, Janet, I had no idea." Janet stared at him, her heart torn between anger and pity. "James," she said quietly, "I don't know if I can do this. I love you, but this is too much." "Janet," he said, his voice breaking, "please don't let this ruin us. I love you more than anything. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Janet closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. After hours of prayer and reflection, she made a decision. She forgave James, but the foundation of their relationship had been shaken. They proceeded with the wedding, but the joy they had once shared felt strained. James tried to be the perfect husband, but the tension between them grew. Arguments became frequent, and one day, in the heat of an argument, James packed his bags and left. Janet was devastated. Night after night, she cried herself to sleep, her dreams turning into vivid nightmares. In one particularly haunting dream, she saw Clara tying strings around a small wooden statue, laughing as she chanted. Janet woke up with a start, her body drenched in sweat. She decided to visit her pastor, seeking guidance. During the prayer session, her pastor suddenly paused, his expression grave. "Janet," he said, his voice low but firm, "I see something in the spirit. Clara has gone to a native doctor to destroy your marriage. She's using voodoo to turn James against you." Janet's heart pounded, her palms growing clammy. Though shocked, she couldn't deny that things had felt unnatural. She resolved to intensify her prayers, determined to save her marriage no matter what. Meanwhile, James, who had reluctantly moved in with Clara and their son, began to feel like a shadow of his former self. Something was wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint what. His thoughts felt foggy, his emotions dulled. Every time he thought of Janet, a wave of anger or indifference would wash over him, and he couldn't explain why. He found himself snapping at people, avoiding his friends, and worst of all, avoiding Janet's calls. It was as though he was no longer in control of his own mind. Clara, on the other hand, seemed unusually content. She would cook his favorite meals, smile at him lovingly, and make every effort to act like the perfect partner. But James noticed something peculiar. She avoided letting him into certain parts of the house, especially her bedroom. She would keep the door locked when she wasn't around, and always seemed to shuffle things out of sight when he entered. One evening, while Clara was out running errands, James decided to search for a document he had misplaced. As he combed through the house, his search eventually led him to Clara's bedroom. The door, for once, was unlocked. Something gnawed at him, a faint voice in his head, urging him to look deeper. He crouched down and lifted the edge of the bedspread, peering underneath. At first, he saw only a box filled with random items, but then his eyes landed on something odd. Hidden in the farthest corner, wrapped in cloth, was a small wooden statue. It was bound tightly with black and white threads, and tied to it was a photograph of himself, his face scratched in places. A small padlock secured the entire thing. James froze, his heart beat fast. He reached out hesitantly and pulled the object closer. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier as he touched it. His hands trembled as he carefully unwrapped the cloth, removing the threads and the photo. As soon as the last thread came loose and the padlock clicked open, he felt a strange sensation, a lightness, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from his chest. Memories of Janet flooded back to him in vivid detail. The way she laughed, the way she held his hand, the way she prayed for him even when he didn't deserve it. His love for her, which had felt distant and clouded, now surged back with full force. Tears welled up in his eyes as he realized what had happened. By the time Clara returned home, James was waiting for her in the living room, the wooden statue on the table before him. His face was a mix of anger and heartbreak. "What is this, Clara?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp as a blade. Clara froze in her tracks, her shopping bags falling from her hands as she saw the statue. Her face turned pale, and she took a step back. "James, I can explain," she stammered. "Explain?" James's voice rose, his hands slamming the table. "Explain what? That you've been using some kind of voodoo to control me? That you've been manipulating me this whole time?" Clara's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, sobbing. "James, please. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't want to lose you. I love you." "You love me?" James shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "You destroyed my marriage. You turned me against the woman I love, and for what? To trap me here with you?" Clara crawled closer, clasping her hands together in desperation. "James, I was scared. I knew you would go back to her, and I couldn't bear it. I went to a native doctor, and he gave me this. He said it would make you stay." James stared at her in disbelief, his chest heaving. He couldn't believe the lengths Clara had gone to, the damage she had caused. He turned away from her, his hands on his head, trying to process everything. "Clara," he said finally, his voice cold, "I want you to take your son and leave. I'm done." Clara crawled to his feet, grabbing his leg. "Please, James, don't do this. Forgive me." James shook her off and stepped away. His phone rang in his pocket, and when he pulled it out, he saw Janet's name on the screen. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Janet," he said, his voice trembling. "James." Her voice was soft but full of pain. "I've been praying for you. I just needed to hear your voice." Hearing her words broke him. Tears streamed down his face as he said, "I'm so sorry, Janet. I've let you down in ways I can't even explain, but I'm coming home. I need to see you." That night, James packed his belongings, leaving Clara sobbing on the floor. He booked a flight to Lagos and arrived at Janet's doorstep. His heart jumped as he knocked, unsure if she would even open the door. When Janet appeared, she looked tired but beautiful. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw him standing there, his suitcase by his side. "James," she said, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" He dropped his bag and fell to his knees. "Janet, I let you down," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I wasn't strong enough. I let someone else come between us, and I let our love suffer. But I swear, I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, if you'll let me." Janet's eyes filled with tears as she knelt down beside him, placing her hand on his cheek. "James," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I've been praying for this moment. I never stopped believing in us." She pulled him into a tight embrace, and they both wept, holding on to each other as though they never wanted to let go again. From that day forward, their marriage blossomed once more. They leaned on their faith, learning to forgive and rebuild what had been broken. Though the road wasn't easy, their love grew stronger with each passing day. They proved that true love, strengthened by resilience and faith, could conquer even the darkest challenges. And as they stood side by side, hand in hand, they knew that together they could face anything.